Welcome. Welcome to all of those here in the McCormick Tribune Forum, as well as those of you who are watching through the Miracle of Media site elsewhere on the Northwestern campus. I'm Owen Youngman. I hold the Knight Chair in Digital Media Strategy here at Medill, and delighted to welcome you to the third and last scheduled lecture in our spring series on Google and the American media. We're sorry that we had to cancel last week's because of a family emergency in Siva Vaidhyanathan's household, but we're excited today to have, at the end of a 2-week-long tour that took him all the way to Korea and back again, Stephen Levy, the author most recently of In the Plex, subtitle of which is How Google Thinks, Works, and Shapes Our Lives. Many of you read his work in Wired. I certainly do, as he observed when he saw my wall of Wired magazines in my office. And probably have read some of his earlier books. Hackers, still read and purchased widely today. Insanely Great, about the Macintosh and Apple. And you know, his combination of reportage and insight has helped to establish him as one of the leading explicators of the changes in America that have been wrought by this thing we call the internet. There have been a spate of books on Google recently, and almost contemporaneously with yours came one from Ken Auletta. You obviously were working on this at the same time. What did you think when you heard about that, and did you ever run into him, and how would you compare the approaches?
Well, when I signed on to do my book, I knew Ken was working on something, and I've known Ken for quite a while, and we're friendly there. And when I landed at Google, because the peg to my book really was, this is going to be about being inside Google and getting access, I noticed that he had a little more access than I had realized, but he was going to come out, I knew, probably a year before I was, and and I have a different viewpoint of the world than he does. He's a media reporter. I'm more interested in the technology side and the changes the technology does. I knew that I would be talking more to the engineers with him, and to be frank, I had a pre-existing relationship with Google and a rapport with the founders from that geek entry point, and that I didn't think that he had there. And when his book came out, of course, the first thing you do is you open up, you look at it and say, well, is there any anecdotes similar, or this and that? And it was a book that focused on media. But on the other hand, it helped me. I think it made my book better by raising the bar. I knew what I had to do now to come up with a book that was going to be fresh, even to people who had read Ken's book.
It was interesting to us, and my students and I, who read many books in my undergraduate class this quarter about Google, who read many books on the topic of Google, to note the differences in approaches. You know, you talked about being inside. We also read books from people like Jeff Jarvis and Siva, who quite pointedly stayed outside. How do you think those varieties of perspective help in helping us to understand this company?
I think it would be pretty useful. I mean, I know that Jeff and I took the exact opposite approaches. He set out to do a book where he wouldn't talk to anyone at Google, and I set out a book where I would talk to everyone at Google. I didn't talk to 20,000 people, but I tried to identify the people who would decode Google for me and then for the readers there. So I think if you really wanted it to get Google, it would be very valuable, obviously more valuable to read my book. But
obviously. And the good news is, if you haven't read it, you can buy a copy afterwards outside, and he'll sign it for you.
Yeah, and yes, and if you have the e-book, then you don't have the signed copy, so you better get another one.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would think that Jeff and Siva both have great things to say about it from where they are. My approach specifically was not to go to these analyses and talk to a lot of people outside Google. The people I talked to outside Google were mainly interviewed about their interactions with Google, as opposed to hearing that the CEO of this newspaper was ticked off at them, or to have some sort of social commentator share his or her views on the threat of Google or the the great things that Google has to offer there. I really wanted to burrow inside and create something that not only would explain Google, but will be somewhat of a narrative in and of itself.
So there's a lot of chatter, and probably too much analysis has been applied to this unofficial motto of Google's that Eric Schmidt let slip one day, as you describe in the book, "Don't be evil." When you talk to people inside Google, at all levels, as you did, how much is that a reflection of what they aspire to be or not be? How real is that in their lives? I mean, we have this official motto too: organize the world's information. But that's a little less touchy-feely.
Right.
What do the real people doing real jobs inside Google think of that?
Well, up to the time where my research for the book was complete, and certainly during the time I was researching it, to my surprise, they had not generally, the executives that regretted that was their motto, and it seeped out there. The communications people did regret it then, but the people at Google still found it a useful metric. They said, we don't say that anymore. In the immediate, in the aftermath of that being coined, which is pretty early in Google's history, people actually would say at a meeting, if something came up and said, wouldn't that be evil? And that would be it. And when I was doing it, I started my intense research in the book around 2008. They wouldn't say that, but it would be there. It would be there in the background, and people didn't seem to regret it. I'm wondering actually now whether that bit has flipped, so to speak, whether no one at Google is probably happy to have that, to be saddled with that now, that some of the criticism is becoming more intense.
Because, for example, just to bounce out of the book into current events for a minute, March 1st, they implemented this new omnibus privacy policy that does something that's the diametric opposite of something that you write about, right? Which is they were proud at one point that what you searched for on YouTube didn't affect what you searched for on Google, and they didn't cross-pollinate. And now, in pursuit of this elegant experience,
right,
there you go. And inevitably, the first question people asked is, isn't this evil? So,
right. Interestingly, they made some changes in the privacy policy in 2010, towards the end of 2010, that moved them a little bit in this direction. And they did that in anticipation of what would become Google+, because they wanted to use some of those results to enhance what happened within Google+. And they actually did that very stealthily, and it really didn't make much of a big impact on people. Sometimes Google does things in the privacy realm, and they do it very well. They clue in the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other places. Other times, they're very ham-handed in doing it. And this was one of those times. The timing was terrible because it came 2 weeks after another black eye, so to speak, which was when they rolled out this thing called Search Plus Your World.
Right. And
which actually, to me, is a little more alarming of the way that came out as the privacy policy. I could see a justification and not a very good explanation of this privacy policy, of what had happened. They were not able to convey really their reasons for it to put the public there. But in general, the overall point is accurate, that 1-2 punch really took Google down a notch in a lot of people's trust, and even among people who were supporters of Google, and people who were on Google's side. They were wondering what happened. And
You know, it's I'm steaming along through this, and it's an indication of how deeply inside Stephen was, that in his epilogue, you know, months before Google Plus comes along, he quotes Gundroda, what's his first name?
Vic Gundotra.
Vic Gundotra, as thinking about social media, and he says, this is the next generation of Google. It's Google +1. And long before there was ever a +1 button in the public domain, but clearly the idea of what they were doing was there. You make a broad and really interesting statement of fact in the subtitle to this book, which is that you're writing not just about the company, which would have been very interesting because of your access and the people you talk to, but you're also writing about how Google thinks, works, and shapes our lives. So what do you think the biggest way that it has shaped our lives actually is? And is that changing in this current competitive marketplace?
I think it's changed our lives in the way not only we get information, but the way we think about what's available to us. In I think 2002, I did a story about Google for Newsweek called "The World According to Google," and I think that's the heading of it.
Yeah.
The search chapter
Yeah.
there, and the idea is that if you're not, in the Google search engine, it's like you don't exist in the world. So, and the world according to Google is our world, because by and large, and their search share just keeps rising. Even to this day, they're up to 83%, and effectively, it's pretty hard to find someone who doesn't go to Google all the time. And the frequency by which we get various information has changed. And all you have to do is look at a class, probably at any level, starting in the 3rd grade probably, and Google is the library. So that's the biggest way. And then of course you add on YouTube and and Android and other things, and also the way that the people at Google operate, I think, is also a sign of the way we're all going to be working in the future. The values that they have, the internet values, are ones that are going to be just top of mind in all businesses and probably our personal lives too. That idea of speed and doing things on a broader scale is just built into the way those people think inside Google, and I think that increasingly is going to reflect on the way we all live our lives, like it or not.
John Battelle, who wrote one of the earliest books on Google, The Search, continues to cover it in his search blog. And within the last several weeks, he's been sort of meditating on, and that's his word, on the changes that he's perceived. And here's a provocative, high-level thumbnail of what he says they have done. He says, they've angered policymakers and pundits with a sweeping change in privacy settings, taken a beating for favoring its own properties in its core search results, Search plus Our World, been caught with its hands in Apple's cookie jar, bypassing Safari privacy settings. And despite the fact Facebook and others previously condoned the practice, it was savaged for doing so. It's continuing to fight an expensive and uncertain patent war, largely around, well, there's lots of that. We've talked about that. And it has this blinkered focus on beating Facebook, which couldn't be more different philosophically. This has caused many to wonder, what on earth has happened to the Google we once knew? What has happened to the Google that you spent all these years inside, do you think? Or are we just perceiving that something has changed?
I think part of it has changed. I think most of what I wrote about Google, that's still there. And they still operate the same way. There's an amazing video that just got posted yesterday.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Of the search launch meeting. It's somewhat stagey, but I was in one of those meetings, and it's pretty much what happens in there. You know, obviously they all knew that the camera was in there.
That's the search quality
Yeah.
meeting. That was in the New York Times magazine, right? That I read.
No.
Or was it in Wired?
No, I was inside this.
It was in
one.
here,
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Okay.
it was in there. Yeah, and that was one of the more fascinating meetings I went to. So there's a lot that's the same, but you know, John is right that it's become an obsession there to be involved in social, to succeed in social. Google, you know, someone told me recently at Google, when I was, around the time I was promoting the book, I did an interview for the audio version with Marissa Mayer, and she was saying to me that, well, look, we got search right, we got ads right, and we've got, you know, mobile right and local. We didn't get social right, and that's the thing was our biggest failure. And it wasn't all that crucial to Google, but now it is very, very important. But I think now that they have lifted it up in their minds to a survival issue. And that's taken them off their game. Also, in the book, I quoted someone in an earlier social effort saying, it's not really like us to be trying to catch up with a competitor. Google's not good at chasing taillights. We're good at just racing forward and not caring who's ahead of us. And so it's almost like a country with the most powerful navy is getting drawn into a land war. You know, so they're, you know, like their big guns aren't being used there. There are super algorithms in order to pursue this social space.
Which actually, I mean, another thing that drew a lot of attention in the run-up to the announcement of the Facebook IPO was just that. And Keith Woolcock in Time, early in February, asked the question, which flows right out of that, is Google in danger of being shut out of the changing internet? Largely because there's all this stuff inside Facebook that we have willingly given Facebook,
Right.
that suddenly they're not crawling. If they are in danger of being shut out, what does that mean for their core business? And if they're not, what do you think how successful are they going to be at getting there? I mean, we all saw the graphic on page 1 of the Journal a couple of weeks ago that said, Facebook, 420 minutes a month, Google Plus, 3.
So they are quite panicked about the degree and the quality of information that Facebook has and doesn't share. I think that they'll declare victory in this battle if finally Facebook is forced to share some of that information. And in fact, it's good for users for Facebook to share that information with our permission. Basically, what Google wants to do is when you go to a search and someone in Facebook who says, it's okay to share my stuff with you, you know, that information could be shared with you when you're signed into Google and you go there, just like they're doing now with Google Plus there. So that's what they want. And actually, it's good for us. And as Facebook gets more and more of a market share, it's going to be under increasing pressure, not only from Google, but from government regulators and users to say, wait a minute, this information isn't yours. This is information that either I don't want to share with other people, you know, and I do, and why is it going to be, you know, limited to what goes on inside your walled garden there? So on the other hand, I'm not quite sure. It's a survival issue for Google. I'm not 100% convinced that this social information is going to be ultimately as important to us as the kind of quality information from Google's algorithms that we get. It's not like, I don't think we're going to stop using Google, even if they don't have our friend recommendations. When I'm looking at, you know, Google about George Washington or my local restaurant, I probably can get by without knowing what my friend Pete thinks about George Washington.
Fair enough. The government regulation question is a fascinating one. I mean, you have a whole chapter called google.gov in which you start to explore some of the implications that come with being huge, having essentially hegemony in a given domain. And we have seen over the last 30 years the government take an interest in IBM, take an interest in Microsoft, and now take an interest in Google. How much, from being inside, how much time do you think they're thinking about that, thinking about that?
Right.
And are there valid concerns for us on the outside in how they respond to government pressure?
Yeah. Well, they feel that the time that they have to spend on this is too much time. It is drawing away from them. It has had a bad effect on them. They have shied away from acquisitions because they knew that even if acquisitions were approved, they met government scrutiny. Just the time it would take to approve an acquisition would reduce the value of it for them. And the ones that they have to bite the bullet and wait until these things go through there. So that's painful for them. And they have to fight against that. They know that their strength is moving fast, and if they have to have this voice behind them saying, well, if you do that, you're going to get in trouble with the government, it's going to constrain them. So they have this push-pull where Google doesn't like to listen to its lawyers and have its lawyers call the shots. They like to say to the lawyers, help us not be slow down in what we do and keep these people away from us. But the government, in large part because places like Microsoft and AT&T have been successfully lobbying and pushing the government has Google in its sights.
And since their mission is to organize the world's information, when the EU starts to push on them, maybe almost in countervailing ways to our government, how does that affect this equation, do you think?
It makes it pretty tough for them because the EU has a lot of other concerns. There's a chauvinistic side to it, where they don't want the Americans to decide what the world is, and the world according to Google. And there was this attempt at a French version,
right.
of Google, which would rank higher things in just because they're in French, or produced in France. So, and that is very, very tough for them. I think Facebook also has real big problems with the EU there. And the last thing that they want, and the last thing the Europeans should want, is to have a balkanized set of product offerings where it's one way for Europe and another way for the US and other places that don't have these regulations.
One place where that obviously comes into play a lot is privacy. And you write a fair amount about their views at various levels, including the CEO level of privacy. And I would almost characterize some of it as, why are people so concerned about privacy when we're trying to do such good things for them? Right? So that made it interesting for me when 3 days ago this new Pew study came out that where they had actually, I thought, from my perspective as a researcher, done a fairly good job of being nuanced and asking questions. And the numbers that came back were 65% view personalized search as bad, 73% view it as a privacy invasion, and yet it's sort of the raison d'etre currently of the way that Google is adapting its algorithm, its tools like Google Instant. Does Google care about numbers like that?
So that's data. Google loves data.
Google loves data, and this
but
is
data. They think they have better data. Their data is how people behave when they go to the search engine. And I've talked to them recently, and they say, guess what? Even though search plus your world doesn't give you, your whole social world, or even a big chunk of it, because we don't have Facebook, we don't have Twitter, but people like it more. By their metrics, they search more, they're happier with the results. So they say, what they're telling these people in the surveys isn't the way they act. And of course, we all know that people don't take advantage of what are pretty good tools that Google offers people in order to tailor not only the search product, but in ads and other kinds of things, you could tailor your privacy settings pretty well, and you could pretty much shut everything off and operate in virtual anonymity while you're using Google there. But no one wants to go through those pages and click all those things off. No one will ever tell you. No company ever tells you how many people actually take advantage of those privacy tools. Facebook won't tell you. Google won't tell you.
The only thing Google...
But we know it's small. When you ask for the ballpark, you're not talking a Major League ballpark. You're talking, the Little League ballpark.
The one number they did cough up, as I recall, during the run-up to the implementation of the new privacy policy was, they said, every page we put this link on it that says, this stuff really matters.
Right.
Click here to, and they said, and 23% was as many people as would go.
Well, even putting that up probably was the thing which caused them the most trouble, because that told people, it's time to panic. And as March 1st came up, I was getting calls from my friends, and they were saying, what should I do? How do I stop this? And people were under the impression that at that point, March 1st, Google would begin to collect more data about you. And actually on March 1st, not really much happened at all. They just had the right, according to their privacy policy, to take information they already had from one thing and use it to, as they say, enhance your experience in another thing. And of course, that would include ads, but I really don't think that was the main impetus of doing this. It really was so they could better compete and make the experience better, so you would go to Google more and then click on the ads.
Who does Google really think of as its competition for the hearts and minds of us, its users? I mean, Siva argues in his book that we actually are its product, that we're the product. But who's leaving that aside for a minute? Who would you say, from what your direct observation has yielded, do they worry about, think about, try to respond to?
Well, right now it's clearly Facebook. It's an easy question to answer, and the relations between Google and Facebook are really terrible now. And it's surprising, because there are a lot of people at Facebook who left Google in the best of terms. Usually when someone leaves Google, they talk about how it was the greatest company in the world to work for, right? And you would think they were coming to Google. They'd always be so enthusiastic about it. But then there was this other opportunity there. And just from Sheryl Sandberg, who was a fairly high executive of Google, who's now the COO of Facebook, on down now, other people there, they feel somehow bitter towards Google. And relations between the companies just are not good at all. They're not great at Twitter, between Twitter and Google either. And I think it's interesting, because I think Twitter has more to gain by being close to Google than it does by fighting Google. I think Facebook is really more of a threat to Twitter than Google is.
And then you've got Apple, which in Jarvis's book, he sort of outlines them as the diametric opposite of Google. The intensely stage managed and carefully controlled environment where everything is great when it comes out, rather than, except for Siri, I guess. Whereas everything at Google is always at beta, beta.
Right. Well, those philosophies are different, and of course, Steve Jobs felt personally betrayed when Google started developing a version of Android that looked a lot like the iPhone. But people at Google admire Apple. They don't, they don't admire Facebook the way they hold up Apple as an example. There's there's Googlers waiting out. Or used to be, when Steve Jobs would give those keynote launches, those Googlers would be waiting out there on the streets the night before to get a good seat. So even though there is a pitched competition there, and they're in court in various fronts, almost every day for some sort of patent dispute with Android and the iPhone, they don't see themselves ultimately as, this is our blood competitor there. They see that as a healthy competition, but not one which is life-threatening to them.
I want to ask one more question, then I would invite those in the audience who have questions to convey those as well. And when we do that, I'll repeat them so that people who are watching online are able to hear them. Because this is a college campus, I don't see how we can avoid talking about YouTube. Mm-hmm. And you spend some time in the book describing the efforts or lack of efforts to integrate YouTube culture and YouTube ethos into that of Google, and ultimately the installation of actual, adult supervision on the YouTube level. How do you think having this literal over-the-garage startup suddenly integrated into the company changed its point of view on other stuff it does? And what have they learned from seeing how people interact with that completely personal and intimate experience of watching a video 4 inches away from them?
Well, originally Google made a really good decision on YouTube was not to fully integrate it. Sometimes Google buys something and everyone goes to Mountain View.
We know about that in this market with FeedBurner.
Yeah, right? Yeah, and and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. There's things like Dodgeball, which was a location system. They were based in Google, New York, but it lost its character, and then the guy who founded it went off and founded Foursquare. So they decided we're not going to move YouTube from where it is. It was in San Bruno, which is about 25 miles or 30 miles from the Google campus there. And it has somewhat of a different culture of its own. It's a little more pop culture-ish.
Different shirt. You described different shirts.
Yeah, right. It's more Hawaiian shirt than T-shirt, and there's more TV culture geeks there than there are. There's a little entertainment and media flair there, and they did bring in one of Google's ace executives to run the thing, but it's only now with this Plus initiative that we're actually seeing the integration of YouTube into one Google. Because before it was something separate, and the wheels are in motion now for that kind of integration, and it'll remain to be seen. There's a lot of people who are YouTube fanatics who don't like it, who don't like this idea of these channels and being pushed on them rather than being sort of a little social network of its own. In the YouTube sphere, a lot of people who are adherents, would think that they don't want this integration, but Google feels pretty strongly that it's going to benefit everyone, and the things you search for on Google, this is one example of this integration. They think it's going to be a benefit. That if you're searching for, if you're a ukulele freak and you're searching for the different kinds of exotic ukuleles in the search engine, you go to YouTube, they can suggest you some really cool videos about the ukuleles.
And that came through, that sort of ambivalence came through in that long New Yorker piece on YouTube that ran a couple weeks ago too. So if you're interested in YouTube, I'm afraid the author is escaping me, but a fine piece that ran in the middle of last month. Steve and I would both be interested in your questions. So who's got one? Win.
I've got one right away. I'm wondering, do you have a sense that at any point during Google's development, they actually sat back and thought about the social ramifications, the cultural ramifications of their emphasis on speed and quantity, that now faster is better, more is better? That has had ramifications far beyond anything.
So Wynn's question is, do you think that at any point the folks at Google stopped to think of the social and cultural ramifications of their emphasis on speed, and faster, and more?
Right. I don't think "stop to think" is a term that comes to mind often when you talk about Google. So the answer would generally would be no. But to the extent they do think about it, they would think it's a good thing.
Yes.
You write a little bit in Plex about their concerns with corporate security, Chinese espionage networks. I'm just curious, given your work in hackers and crypto, if you have any interest in or currently working on projects about contemporary cybersecurity concepts.
Question is whether, given his interest as evidenced in hackers and crypto and security and that sort of thing, are you thinking about that much? Are you working on that?
Well, I do keep an eye on that, and I really was interested in that particular break-in, not only because I was following the China situation pretty closely, and my last big reporting trip in China was just a few weeks before that thing broke. But the impact on Google's security itself. Google itself went into a sort of corporate shutdown after that, and everyone had to do this dual factor thing, and then they introduced dual factor security. And to explain what that is, that's when you use Gmail and or other Google products, and just typing in your password isn't enough to get it going. They have to send a little code to your phone for the first time, and then you put it in the phone. And anytime you use Google on a new computer, that happens, and every 30 days you have to renew it. And it's somewhat of a pain in the neck, but not too much. And what that stops is basically anyone from stealing your account. And there was a terrific story by James Fallows in The Atlantic about his wife's Gmail account was hacked.
Right.
And this particular malfeasant not only was able to read her mail and send things from it, but for some reason, this is capricious, they didn't have to do, deleted all the mail. And there's like 5 years of mail she had, which of course she didn't back up. Who backs up their Gmail? Gone. And because James has a little pull at Google, he's friends with Eric Schmidt and other things. He was able to get them to take an extra mile, and they were able to recover it. And they say they have systems now that, with great trouble, they might be able to recover things in that case. But in any case, that's what you risk by leaving yourself open there. And there's a big part of your life out there from that Google account, and that helped awaken Google to something that not only should they do it, but it would be good for their users to do it. Now, I'm sure a pretty small percentage do it. After James, it took me James Fallow's article to have me do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating anecdotes, and it was widely reported at the time your book came out, was how Google decided not to get sort of into the cloud storage business because it wasn't googly, right?
Right.
It sort of flew in the
Was,
face.
yeah, and really, specifically, it wasn't Chromey.
It wasn't Chromey, okay.
Yeah, because the Chrome system came up, and they have the Chrome operating system, which is built on the idea that we're going to go straight to the cloud there, and it's premature. When I first got that little prototype of the Chrome operating system there, I said, basically they're delivering you a future that's going to be around in 10 years, but right now you just don't have constant connectivity. You can't count on it, and applications developers have not done everything as a web app. There's a lot of things that you can't do on that. But the cancellation of G Drive, which is the product you're talking about, which is sort of a Dropbox kind of cloud storage thing, came because they assumed that we wouldn't have any files in the future. So if there's no more files, why do this? And now I think they're considering going back to that, and I wouldn't be surprised in the next few weeks even if we see what is the resurrected G Drive.
Because obviously Dropbox has found a tremendous niche, and Apple with iCloud is getting a lot of traction around that.
And certainly is a strength of Google's to be able to provide that. We haven't talked about infrastructure.
Yeah,
that's a giant strength of Google. That they not only have a huge network of databases, they own more fiber than any other entity in the world. So they're able to deliver things cheaper, and their data centers are more efficient than anyone else. So that's why they were able to take YouTube through those many years when not much money was coming in, because it was much cheaper than people thought to deliver all those videos, even though it took an incredible amount of bandwidth.
More questions? Carlos.
I was thinking during your talk, when you talked about the search results and search cluster world, of how they've evolved over the years. And I was wondering if you could sum up what motivates Google now, because it seems like Facebook is so short-sighted, and I don't see them organizing the world's information too much in new ways lately. Do you have a different answer of what motivates them now?
So the question is, what motivates Google now? It seems to the questioner that beat Facebook is kind of short-sighted.
Yeah. Right. Well, to be fair, I wouldn't just say beat Facebook. I would say to integrate identity. They feel in order to do what they always wanted to do it better, they have to know who you are. And they'd like to know more of your interests and who you're in contact with and more about you, so they can deliver a more personalized experience, so they can keep improving there, right? And but I think that to be successful in this larger sphere and not be shut out of that world is a part of it too. And the other thing that they want to do is, I think that they would like to develop some new business, some moonshot they call it. They use the word moonshot a lot. Some moonshot kind of business that leverages their strengths, which is handling big data really fast and having really great algorithms and using machine learning, artificial intelligence, to do something new that bounces off that. So an example would be their autonomous cars, and they're working. To be honest, I don't know what they are, but I know they're working on several big projects. Big risk projects in this division called Google X that might do that. So I think they want to do that in some way that has a connection with the rest of it. But their motivation, I think, is the same as it always is, to grow up and provide you everything you need to know about everything instantly.
Questions? Oh yeah, Mike.
What's your take on how they'll be as an owner of a very different company in Motorola?
What's your take on what they'll be like as the owner of Motorola Mobility?
Right. Yeah. Well, I gave it a talk.
He was in Lake County last night, which is Motorola Mobility country.
And Lake County College, and the people there were smart enough to invite a bunch, put some flyers, I think, at Mobility there, and
I'll bet they did.
And so this is classic Larry Page, what happened here. And so Google has this patent problem. They need these patents in order for mutual assured destruction in the smartphones. They try to buy a couple patent portfolios, and their competitors gang up against them in a way which is so skanky that the government's looking into it, but they can't get the portfolios. So what do? So they spend not only billions for a portfolio, but billions more to have a giant company attached to it. And it has some risk because this company competes with their partners in Android there. But so, and this is Larry. He solves a problem by making the whole situation bigger and coming up with a different solution. The question is, what's that solution? What are they going to do with it? Google, I can't conceive of Google buying Motorola Mobility and just going on with it in the same business as usual kind of way. I think they're going to come up with something disruptive attached to it. And my prediction, and I'm out on a limb with this because it's unusual, is that they're going to give phones away. I think that it's consistent with the way they operate. You look at what they did with GPS navigation and things like that. And I think that just the way they give away Google Voice, why not give away the phone and have you tethered to Google for however long you have that thing in your hand?
That would make sense. I'm so old that at one point in the 80s, I proposed inside the Tribune Company that there would come a day, obviously I didn't see the internet coming, where we would give away fax machines so that we could send personalized news to people on their kitchen tables.
Right.
and they would pay for that. And so, I mean, I think this is kind of a logical extension when you...
Right. Right. It's a long shot, so it's crazy enough that if I'm wrong, I'm saying, well, you know, I try, but if I'm right, you know.
But if you're right, you know...
You heard it here first.
Absolutely. Back here.
Giving
What
away
about giving away the patents?
That's just a question. It's been discussed with a few smaller publications. What about the possibility we put Motorola those patents released in the wild to offset out?
Well,
Possibility of
yeah.
releasing the patents into the wild to offset Apple.
well, you know, I guess if there's a discussion on this by knowledgeable people, I might be missing something, but unilaterally laying down arms when people are suing you, I don't know how that would stop lawsuits coming into Google by laying down the patents. They, you know, I guess they need them, you know, in order to basically say that, you know, well, if Apple is suing us, we're going to, you know, then sue them on, you know, whatever infringements we could imagine from these broad patents the Motorola has. I think probably the best thing that would happen would be in the patent situation is if you know, the judges basically said, you know, look, because of all this infringement things, we no longer can have smartphones, and the sales of smartphones stop tomorrow. And then maybe people would sit down and come up with a decent way that we could handle the situation.
Before we go to the next question, let me just bounce off that on yesterday's news about Yahoo's nuclear option suit against Facebook. As an observer of this whole Silicon Valley scene and all these companies, what do you think of that? Where's that going?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's a deja vu thing. I write in the book there about how Yahoo filed a patent suit against Google on the eve of their IPO. And this was based on patents from the company they bought called Overture. And Overture had a very innovative ad system with two really big characteristics, that both of which Google swiped from them. But it swiped legally because, you know, Overture was doing, you know, the predecessor company GoTo was doing so well that they failed to make it to their way to the patent office during the first year of operation and didn't get patents for pay-per-click on ads or auctioning off search ads. And when they realized this, they immediately rushed the patent office with these secondary patents that Bill Gross, the head, the creator of GoTo, described to me as silly patents. Right? You know, he thought they weren't very serious, but the very fact that these, you know, lawsuits exist and have some credibility is a negative for potential shareholders. You know, and the stock price on an IPO, and Google spent a couple $100 million to make it go away, as I expect Facebook will do, whether they like these patents or not.
Carol.
Since we are on a college campus, could you talk about Google's hiring practices? What kind of people do they really want working inside their companies, and you know, what does it take to get a job?
So Carol's asking, what does it take to get a job at Google? What kind of people do they really look for? And we were talking a little earlier about Bill Poundstone's book. Bill was here in January and talked a little bit about that too. But what's your take? Because you, again, you saw it up close.
Well, it's somewhat of an elitist system there, and, you know, in a way that doesn't 100% really serve Google there. They're big on metrics, so the people they want have to be really, really smart, because you don't want to be stuck in an elevator or an airport with someone who isn't really, really, really smart. And, you know, and they pride themselves. They say one reason why things work so well at Google is that every person in the room is the smartest person in some other room. And so they ask for your, you know, SAT scores, first of all. And that's the figure, you know, if you have a super high SAT score, you've got to be pretty smart. And they want you to be pretty ambitious, too. So they say, you know, well, what was your GPA in college? Right? So, you know, just being smart and, you know, playing beer pong it isn't the kind of person that they want. So, and even people who are in mid-career, who they interview, I've talked to any number of people in their 40s who were shocked when Google made them dig up their GPAs. And also, they discriminate by school. You know, they really, you know, prefer people to be from Ivy League schools or Stanford or, you know, Caltech or, you know, the schools, you know, Northwestern would probably qualify, so don't worry.
Oh, I would think so.
But and that is the prejudice from the top, really. And I don't know if it still happens. I imagine it does. But as the time I finished the book, because I fact-checked this, every single hire at Google goes through Larry Page. And they have a little system they have where he can, just like take a glance at some of the metrics of the people they hire, and then he could, drill down if he wants, if he sees something that bothers him or gets his attention, and look down into the hiring folder there. And every so often he'll bounce something. And one red flag for him is one of these like low metrics. And the people who do the hiring will have to justify hiring someone who doesn't meet some of those standards.
So what do you come away with when we think about metrics for a minute? Because that's shot through not only this book, but everything we know about them. On balance, are they missing something by being so data focused? And if so, what might it be?
Well, I think in this case they probably are, and I think they maybe put too much emphasis on that kind of data because they hire so many people there. So you look at someone in mid-career, and obviously if you were making algorithms for it, just like over the years PageRank is less and less a component of the search engine as they come up with other signals, that these, when you're in your 40s, these metrics, which were compiled when you were, in your teens and early 20s, become less significant. Particularly, what's a GPA compared to the achievements you've done in your career? So I think, and I believe that, and I've talked to people at Google this, the HR people agree totally with this, that the best person out of Temple University, where I come from, is going to be a better worker, I'll bet, than the 60th best person even out of Stanford.
Absolutely. Larry, did you have something?
Yeah, it's actually sort of we're talking about. What is their model for a better experience other than more time and more clicks? I mean, given how metrics-based they are, maybe not so much what are they missing, but what are they worried that they're missing in terms of the things that they wish they could measure better to think about experiences more qualitative, in a way that right now is more qualitative.
So it's a question about what metrics might matter beyond more time spent and more clicks.
Well, time spent, on the search engine is a negative, right? So, so when they measure happiness, it's, if you click on a top result and don't come back. And if you come back and refine your result, that's terrible. And they'll look at that closely. But as you're right, if you look at things like YouTube, they want you to be on more. If you look at Gmail, they want you to, not only have more mail, but now involve more people in there. And now it's other kind of communications there. So the question would be, how do they, when they have you on email, how would they have you use the GChat more there? And it becomes pushing you to other products now there. As they're very big now on integration. This informal model is one Google there. And that has changes for people who love this product for Google or that product for Google, and those products might change, not because they're serving the laser focus, the user of Gmail or the user of search, but well, maybe this will change because we want to get you there too, and I think that's a danger.
Well, I want to wrap up with one more speculative question, like the one you already answered.
Okay.
So we know what Google has been. We know what it is today, growing, and with its growing time span, its growing share. Is there anything that, in your estimation, could be a wall that they would hit that would start them on a downward slope to the kind of, if not irrelevance, less importance than they have today? As we have seen with every company almost in the history of American business, there's some inflection point where you've reached the peak and now you're skidding down the hill. I mean, is there anything that could make that happen to Google that you could?
It's hard to picture because you see the core of Google really is search, and it's hard to picture how that goes away. That's not a fad. That's something that's built into what we do every single day. And I think that Facebook has proved that social is really important, but I wouldn't be shocked if that became, if the degree to which we do it now gets modulated some way, or that gets balkanized through other services somehow. A key point for Google was having a successful mobile strategy there. When they bought Android, in a sense, no one realized, including them, how important that was going to be for Google. Most searches are probably done on mobile devices now. So you can imagine how difficult things would be for Google now if they weren't part of that there. That would be the number one concern then, if they hadn't aced that. So I would say they would have to do major messing up, which was only I guess smart people have messed up a lot in the past, but I would say the worst case scenario for Google, and they know this, is probably just milking a cash cow and not growing.
Okay, well, go ahead, Patrick, and then we'll wrap.
It seems like it would be easy to regulate separation of ad serving from search result serving. Is there any concern about that? So you talked about antitrust in Google, and you seem to say geographic balkanization is their primary concern.
Patrick observes that you think that government could easily regulate the separation of search and ad serving. Any concern about that?
Right. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, because search the ads, that Google will tell you those ads are not related to organic search. It's it's a different process there. Now, if what you're talking about is mixing that with Google's other ad business, the DoubleClick business, which they're saying even now they're not going to do. That's another story, and that is something which would be, I think, a valid concern for all of us. Just to explain that Google does two kinds of ads. One is the ads that appear on your search page to the right of the search results that are tied to the queries you type in when you search. And in theory, maybe some of those will be affected by what you might look at YouTube or other things, or even stuff in your Gmail now. The second is that Google owns a company called DoubleClick, which is involved in display ads on other people's websites. And like other ad networks, this basically plants a bug in your browser and watches where you go, so they could serve relevant ads when you go off to the New York Times site or someone's blog even. And there might be an argument to say that those businesses should not be merged there. Right now, literally in the privacy policy, it says we're not going to do that now. And that is somewhat radioactive, because there is this passive tracking component to that isn't in the Google products. Google doesn't track you, and I consider tracking meaning watching you when you're not using that. And it is like, and that's something that Congress is really looking at, and just that whole technology which the display ad business works on, which I find actually troubling, and would expect some regulation, but the alternative would be some sort of self-policing, which sort of does the trick.
Well, we're going to wrap this section up, and as noted, you can buy this book out in the lobby. Frankly, as you've seen, Google's on the front page of some newspaper or some website pretty much every day, and I can assure you that if you read this book, you'll have way more context for those individual little bursts of data than you would otherwise, and you'll be able to put it more in the context of how it affects your life. So I highly recommend it if you don't have it. I recommend somebody develop a good Sign My ebook app, which I've been looking for. And let's thank Stephen Levy for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.